Hey everyone, it's Patch 2.23 Affliction, and today I want to talk about the Righteous Fire swap for Manaforged arrows. This is going to be the thing that makes this build silly. This is going to be the thing that makes this build do an unbelievable amount of damage, and it's going to be the thing that allows you to immediately just delete Ubers in half a second. Righteous Providence is a Inquisitor node that we are looking to pick up with a Flesh and Flame as we are Hierophant. And what it does is it's going to allow us to start scaling strength and intelligence substantially higher than we were previously, which is going to give us a lot of crit chance. And this crit chance is going to effectively crit cap us for free, while still at the same time benefiting from the intelligence and strength we're picking up to not only make our build unbelievably tanky, but also make our build do silly amounts of DPS. As always, the notes section for the path to building has been updated with all the changes. Some things in here have not changed, as some things are basically still the same, while some things only received a minor wording difference, but about half of the sections in this path to building have been changed to accommodate for the swap over to Righteous Providence. So first thing we should talk about is, well, the Flesh and Flames themselves. This does not work if you do not have yourself a Righteous Providence Forbidden Flesh and a Righteous Providence Forbidden Flame. If you want to know on how to min-max this build before you get yourselves one of these, there will be a link in the description below on my min-max version of this build with no Righteous Providence. But no matter what, you need these to be able to swap over to Righteous Providence. Now, at the time of making this video, I do want to say that currently Righteous Providence is worth way too much money in the current league. Righteous Providence and mana stacking builds in general are very expensive, meaning if you want to swap over to this version of the setup, you are going to basically pay a mirror up front. Now, a few days ago, these were worth about 200 div or so, but unfortunately, due to one, this build becoming pretty popular, and two, a Archmage setup with Righteous Providence becoming really popular, while at the same time some other mana builds also want this jewel as well. The jewel has pushed to an unbelievably high price. I never thought I would have to make a video guide on a 1+ mirror swap that is required to be able to keep upgrading the build, but unfortunately here we are and the prices are a little bit crazy. With that said, we will still try to go over everything the best we can. I'm just very, very sorry that currently the prices for this are so absurdly high that it's realistically out of most people's price budget, / this is basically an endgame item that for most people would become a chase item at this point. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the passive tree and what's going to change here. There's going to be very minor passive tree changes. The first one you'll notice is we are not pathing over to this jewel socket anymore because we do not need to pick up a Thread of Hope to get ourselves Elemental Overload. As you can see, Elemental Overload is now a massive brick for our build because we are going to stack a lot of crit chance and we're going to stack a lot of crit multiplier, meaning Elemental Overload isn't needed anymore. That means we can take all these points over here and do something more useful with them. First off, we're going to be picking up True Strike on the passive tree. Not only is this a great amount of crit chance and crit multi, but it's also another thing within your Lethal Pride, meaning you can potentially look for a new Lethal Pride now with even potentially better combos on all of the notables that we have within the radius. But picking this up not only gives us that, but it's also going to give us a little bit more strength, which is now very relevant as we want to get our strength and our intelligence as high as possible. Now, ideally, and this will happen in a more min-max setup, there's just a pretty bare bones get swapped over to Righteous Providence setup, you will hit substantially higher strength and intelligence numbers. Now, the most strength you're going to ever want in this build is going to be 1,700, and you're not going to realistically see that until a super min-max setup. But if you do get to that point, you would never want to go past that. 1,700 strength is basically just enough strength through the 1% chance per point to get you to crit cap. So anything past that is overkill, and you wouldn't really care to keep going. But with intelligence, the sky's the limit, because not only does intelligence give us more tankiness, but it does scale our damage very well, as more intelligence also gives us more mana, which means we can ramp substantially harder. Other than that, we are also going to go over here and pick up Throat Seeker, as Throat Seeker gives us a lot of crit multi. I know the pathing looks a little bit jank here, but it is very much worth it, as crit multi is just an amazing stat for us to have. You might be asking yourself, why don't we just go and pick up Heartseeker instead? Well, the reason we don't get Heartseeker is because the two nodes leading to it are crit chance, which we don't really care about, as we are going to have more than enough crit chance. I know we're not crit capped here, but we will very quickly become crit capped as we put more and more money into the setup. So pick up Throat Seeker for the two crit multi small nodes is going to be a lot better. Other than that, the only other thing changing about a tree is potentially picking up all of the flat strength and flat int nodes. We have 2 over here, and we do have ourselves a flat strength node over here. You can opt to pick these if you want to give yourself a little bit more strength, and you could do something like dropping Mind Drinker. And then lastly, the only other major tree change here is going to be that we're going to get ourselves an Impossible Escape, either with Imbalanced Guard, or if you're on a budget, we're going to get ourselves an Unwavering Stance, Possible Escape, to pick up ourselves Prismatic Skin, which is a lot of effective health pool, and to pick ourselves Soul of Steel, which is also another little bit of effective health pool. The only thing this build ever really needs is just increased maximum resistances, so being at 78% is going to make us feel substantially tankier. There is also another small thing you can do if you do want to make this build a little bit better for mapping, which we'll talk about next. What I'd recommend is to drop 3 passive points somewhere. Either drop yourself Mind Drinker and then get rid of Thieves Craft, or you could potentially just drop Taste of Blood and Leech Mastery, which will make you a little bit squishier. But the point is, try to find 3 points that you're willing to give up on the tree. And what you'd want to do is to pick up Piercing Shots. Piercing Shots will give you +2 pierce, and a small node will give you +1 pierce. If you do end up just dropping Taste of Blood for it, you can even pick up the 15% more projectile speed mastery. But if you are going to do a lot of mapping, if you're going to do anything that's not bossing, this would be very ideal, and this would make the build feel really, really good in mapping. We're not using Fork, we're not using Chain, we're not using any sort of modifier on our projectiles. So Lightning Arrow is going to feel a little bit bad, as it's not going to be able to realistically impact the far end of a pack of monsters. So with +3 pierce, you'll have no problems, and it'll make your mapping feel substantially better, and it'll make it feel substantially faster. Other than that, we are going to want to make a few changes to our skills. Now, I've mentioned this in the previous video, but I do want to go over this again here. So personally, what I've started doing for this build is I got myself 2 separate Widow Hails. And the reason I did this is because the setup that you'd want for mapping and the setup that you'd want for bossing/delving is different. Now, for basically all content, especially now that you swapped over Righteous Providence and you have a lot of crit multi and a lot of crit chance, you can realistically do all of it with Lightning Arrow, except for bosses. Lightning Arrow just does not do enough small hits to generate yourself enough mana leech to be able to sustain your mana cost. So you are going to need to run Rain of Arrows. If you're just going to map, if you're never going to do Uber bosses, or if you're never going to do delve, you don't need to have 2 bows like this. But because I do a little bit of mapping and I am delving and doing boss at the same time, I am just opting to have a second bow with me for when I'm delving and for when I'm mapping. But the only issue here is we are going to have to eventually drop our unset ring, as we are going to need to find a way to fit in Fire Res. Because we're going to do that, we're going to be missing 1 jewel socket. And because of that, you're going to have to sacrifice something. Now, we can't sacrifice Clarity because Clarity is giving us so much energy shield. As you can see, I'm at 15,000 energy shield. If I turn off Clarity, I go down to 13,000. That's quite a lot of energy shield to sacrifice. So our only options here is to instead sacrifice Sigil Power or to sacrifice Frostblink, as otherwise you will not be able to fit everything in here. Now, if you're mapping, what I would really recommend for you to do is to just sacrifice the Sigil Power, as they're going to be way too overpowered anyways, that the Sigil Power isn't going to really do much. And while you're mapping, you're never going to really put it down anyways. And that way you get to keep yourself Frostblink for mapping. But what you can do for bossing and for delving is to actually only run a 5-link bow. We don't need a 6th link because we are picking up Clever Thief on the tree. And as I mentioned in the previous video, Clever Thief is so strong for Mana Leech that we can just completely drop Mana Leech from all of our links in general. We don't have one in Lightning Arrow, and we're instead running faster projectiles, Mirage Archer, and return projectiles for more utility. And instead of adding in an additional 6th link here to make up for the fact that we aren't going to want to keep an unset ring forever, I did opt to just 5-link my Rain of Arrows, and that way I can put Frostblink in my bow. I can keep Clarity, so we get to keep our Watcher's Eye mod, and that way we can keep Sigil Power in our boots to not give up anything without really noticing any difference. Currently, at the time making this guide, I'm around 1.6k depth, and I can tell you I've not noticed a single difference between me having a 5-link and a 6-link Rain of Arrows setup. The other small thing I want to mention about your gem setup is in your offhand, personally what I've opted to do is to run a Shield Charge and a faster attacks in my all DH, which is going to give me superior movement speed in maps, especially if I need to run around a bunch. And what we used to do before is we used to run Enhance as well. But personally, I just like the combo of Frostblink Shield Charge so much. And the fact that for me, with my Rain of Arrows setup, my Frostblink is in my bow, and it has to be here because if your Sigil Power is in your bow, for example, and I were to Sigil Power and that was going to bow swap to Battle Mage's Cry, as you can see, my Sigil Power disappears. So we need to keep our Sigil Power in our boots. And because of that, because we lose Frostblink, personally, I chose to put a Frostblink in my LD with my shield charge just to not lose the comfiness of Frostblink shield charge, which just feels way too good as a mobility combo together. Other than that, nothing else is changing about any of our skills. They're all staying the same. Just the only thing you want to consider is everything I just mentioned with your Frostblink setup and with your double bows to have more comfy mapping, as well as considering removing Sigil of Power and putting your Frostblink in your boots if you do plan to just do nothing but mapping or simming or doing literally anything that isn't Uber bosses or delving specifically. And moving on next, let's talk about the gear. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Poised Prism replacement. I want to say this up front. You do not need to mirror anything for this build, especially with how expensive the Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flames have gotten. Realistically, asking people to get a one mirror Forbidden Flame and then telling them you need to also mirror something is stupid. So please, please, please just listen to what I'm saying right now. You do not need to mirror anything for this build. But the first thing we need to talk about that is going to push this build to just stupid is going to be what you actually want to finally replace your Poised Prism with. So in Affliction, I ended up crafting the Mirror Quiver for this build. We have gone for a synthesis base with percent int, crit multi, and Grace Aura Effect. Now, some people can say that, and you can make an argument that Grace Aura Effect is weaker than flat strength or percent strength, but that doesn't really matter. If you want to very quickly hop over to a super min-max path of building that I've been working on over the past week or so for this build, as you can see, we can still hit about 1.7k strength, and I am crit capped, meaning the flat strength and the percent strength on a quiver is completely useless, as getting any more strength over the point to where you crit cap is completely pointless, and you just want to keep stacking as much intelligence as possible. So because that, we opted for Grace Aura Effect, which is then being tripled by our Widow Hail, which means we are getting an unbelievable amount of evasion rating, meaning it's pushing our evade chance to very high levels. If you want to think about it in terms of spell suppression, you know how 90 to 95% spell suppression is substantially weaker than 100% spell suppression? Well, the same goes for evasion rating. The closer you are to 95% evade chance, the better. So with that all said, that is why we went for these synth blizzards for the people who care about the reasoning why. But the whole point of this is that realistically, until you get yourself a synthesis quiver, you're not going to be able to beat Poised Prism, and you're still going to want to keep running Poised Prism for as long as you can. But if you do want to min-max this build further, if you do want to make this build as insane as possible, getting yourself a synth quiver and getting yourself a copy of my quiver is going to be what's going to push this build to just even more silly levels. As you can see here, it's going to give you about a 55% DPS increase. It's also at the same time going to give you almost 3,000 extra energy shield and 1,500 extra mana, making you unbelievably tanky and making your damage be laughably high. The other thing to mention here is because it has double crit multi on it, it's going to give you 225 crit multi, pushing your crit multi from 415% all the way up to 640%. Realistically, crafting your own synth quiver isn't really going to be worth it, as one, finding percent int and percent crit multi bases is very difficult, and you need both percent int and percent multi to actually make a quiver that's going to be Poised Prism, and the crafting process itself for the prefixes and suffixes is going to be very expensive. Again, I want to say this one more time, you do not need to mirror this quiver, and you do not need a mirrored quiver to be able to play this build to its full extent, but for the people who do want to min-max, this would finally be what you replace your Poised Prism with. And if you do want to mirror items for this build, since at this point I do own all of the mirror items for this build, this would be the one you really, really want to make sure you get over anything else. Moving on next, we are going to want to make ourselves a new pair of boots for this build now. I did talk about these boots in the pre-Righteous Providence setup, as these boots are fairly easy to make, and we can make them with strength on them beforehand to have ourselves a pair of boots ready to go. But if you haven't crafted yourself a new pair of boots, these are very easy to make. We're going to get ourselves a pair of Chaos Resistance Fractured Sorcerer boots, and then we're going to be spamming Rage Essences on the boots until we hit Tier 1 Intelligence, because strength cannot naturally roll on int boots. And then we're going to finally finish the craft by using a Veiled Chaos Orb to either unveil movement speed or mana on the boots, and then we're going to craft the other one. There is a full crafting guide for these boots in the notes section, and there's also going to be an accompanying video guide that's releasing at the same time as this video on how to make them if you want a visual guide on how to do the whole craft. The other thing that's going to change here is going to be us getting our new ring. So before we were using a Shavs and we were using some other random ring, but now we finally want to move on to a proper strength and int ring for this build. Our other ring is going to be a Calandra's Touch, but you don't need to use a Calandra's Touch. This is just simply here to just showcase that you want two of the same ring. So if getting yourself a second copy of these rings is going to be more expensive than getting yourself a Calandra's Touch, then you should just buy a Calandra's Touch. as this is just a second copy. But if your crafting costs on this ring were cheaper than to just buying a Calandra's Touch, you should just do this craft twice. So this craft is very simple. We want to specifically use a ruby ring. If I were to turn off my coruscating elixir, and if I were to take off the ruby ring, as you can see, we're only at 50% fire res. Guarantee resistances are going to be taken care of by our mage blood, and we already do have an additional elemental resistances flask suffix on one of our flasks. So no matter what, we're going to need a little bit of fire resistance. So because of that, we are going to find a ruby ring base specifically. Now, the way these are going to be crafted is very simple. And again, there's going to be a whole video and there's going to be a whole section in the note section on how to craft this ring specifically. All this is going to be either a fractured strength or a fractured int or a fractured crit multi base. The crit multi base is going to be rare and expensive, so you're most likely going to use fractured strength or fractured int. And then you're going to be using most likely crit multi essences to roll for the fractured attributes that you didn't buy. So if you buy yourself fractured strength, you'd crit multi essence roll until you hit tier 1 intelligence. And then for the prefixes, all we're going to be doing is using a veiled chaos orb, and we're going to hopefully unveil any of the mana mods. And then we're going to finally craft energy shield if you have space on it. Now, if you do opt to not get a Calandra's Touch and you are going to make a second one of these rings, you don't need a second ruby ring to be fire res capped. Just one ring alone will be enough to put you at fire res cap with no coruscating elixir active. But personally, I would recommend to potentially get a second one just so you're a little bit overcapped in case you get exposed or in case you have a flammability or an elemental weakness on you. But if you feel like you're fine, and again, your coruscating is going to be active most of the time, so you'll be super res capped anyways. You can opt to, instead of getting a second ruby ring, just get yourself an amethyst ring or get yourself an unset ring, and then you won't have any of the pocketing issues I mentioned earlier in the video. Or you can get yourself a cerulean ring to get yourself increased maximum mana. And lastly, the other major gear change that is going to happen here is going to be the jewels themselves, as we are going to have quite a few changes. So the first thing to mention is going to be the Emperor's Mastery. This is a jewel that's just going to give us a bunch of increased attributes. So this means we get 7% increased strength and intelligence, as well as 5% increased global defenses, which is great because that means we just get 5% more ES, making ourselves a little bit tankier. This jewel is a little bit expensive, and this is basically just a stat stick. So if you can't afford an Emperor's Mastery immediately, what I'd recommend to do is to just get yourself a rare jewel with strength and intelligence on it and any other stats you need. Now, what I want to mention here, and this is very important, is you will need one of these unique jewels to have corrupted blood immunity on them. Now, the cheapest one here and the most reasonable one for you to actually get corrupted blood immunity on is your Storm Shroud. But currently, corrupted blood immunity storm shrouds are very expensive. So I'd recommend for you to do, to be able to put this together, is to instead just opt to not get yourself an Emperor's Mastery, or opt to not get yourself an Impossible Escape, which we'll talk about more in a little bit, and to replace either Impossible Escape or your Emperor's Mastery, which is a rare jewel with corrupted blood immunity on it. But once you get yourself a Storm Shroud with corrupted blood immunity on it, you can get the rest of these jewels together. So moving on next to this next one is going to be Impossible Escape. Now, Impossible Escape is a really nice jewel. What you can do with this, assuming it's not in your cluster jewels, because if you put in your cluster jewels, it just doesn't work. So just make sure you put in this jewel socket instead, or this jewel socket instead, is it allows you to pick up any points around a certain keystone, as this can come with any keystone rolled on it. And ideally, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get ourselves an Imbalanced Guard variant of this jewel, so we can pick up both Prismatic Skin and Soul Steel for free without us having to path over here, as maximum elemental resistances is a great way to make this build tankier. Now, these are going to be expensive, as quite a lot of builds want specifically Imbalanced Guard. So what you can instead do is opt for the cheaper Unwavering Stance one, which is going to typically be about half the price of Imbalanced Guard. And it's still going to have Prismatic Skin within range, meaning you will at least get the +2 maximum elemental resistances, but you won't be able to get Soul Steel until you get yourself an Imbalanced Guard version. If you do get yourself an Unwavering Stance version and pick up Prismatic Skin, what you can do with this extra passive points is to potentially just pick up 30 strength through prowess, or to just pick up a mastery somewhere, or just pick up a little bit of ES wherever you can. And the final thing to mention here about our jewels is going to be the charms that we want to use with Primalists. So now that we're swapping over to Righteous Providence, now that we want as much strength and intelligence as possible, we are going to want to change our charms a little bit. So we're still going to need to run 1% of Leech's instance somewhere, and we're still going to need to run 1 Cooling Strike somewhere. Again, you do not need a Cooling Strike and Leech's instant charm together. You can have one of these stats on any of these. It's just I put it together to make it a little bit easier to follow along. But for the rest of the prefixes and suffixes on all of your charms, you're going to want to fit in both percent strength and the hybrid strength and intelligence flat rolls. Now, getting yourself a charm like this is going to be expensive. Percent strength and flat strength int is very expensive. So what you can instead do is opt to keep the charms that you already had, or opt to get some of your old charm mods on these charms instead. So you can instead replace the strength and int with maximum mana is converted into maximum ES, or you could replace the percent strength with the elemental damage penetration mod instead. But if you want to talk about ideal circumstances, we do want to get specifically these. Now, these do have quite a big roll on them. The strength rolls anywhere between 3% to 8%, and the flat rolls anywhere between, I believe, 15 to 40. So you can find some lower rolled ones for substantially cheaper, but if you want to get yourself anything that's close to a max roll, it's going to be fairly expensive. The last few things that I want to talk about are going to be some other things that you can get to make some of your other items better. The first thing to mention here is going to be your Watcher's Eye. Up to this point, we'd be running a maximum mana as maximum energy shield Watcher's Eye, but at this point you can potentially look to get yourself a second stat on it, and personally what I've been running is recover percent of mana when you use a skill while affected by clarity. This makes it so if you had any mana issues prior, you will not have any mana issues anymore. But another option instead, and it's going to be a little bit more expensive, is to potentially go for the Grace additional chance to evade. This is going to allow you to get to 95% chance to evade, which is going to give you an unbelievable amount of EHP. Now, this is not going to really show up in Path to Building because Path to Building doesn't really appreciate how much less melees you take from 89 to 95% evasion rating, just because the way it's calculating the max hits doesn't really incorporate that. But when you specifically look at damage from melees, being a 95% evade chance effectively means you're taking 50% less damage from any sort of damage instance that came from an auto attack or from something that is evadable. Another thing you can change is obviously to get yourself a better Great Wolf. This is something you can consistently keep upgrading, and this is something you consistently look for a higher and higher roll of, and it's just going to cost more and more money. And what you can do this league, which I really won't recommend due to how expensive it is, and this is something you would just do as a high-end min-max, is to use Tainted Catalyst, which now would allow you to actually put a quality on your Great Wolf, and you're going to be hoping that you get yourself either mana or attribute. The way these work is it's going to give the item you use it on a random catalyst type with a random percent on it, meaning you're probably going to have to use 30, 40, 50 of these on your Great Wolf to get something very useful. Personally, for me on my Great Wolf, I end up getting 14% attribute on it after 30, 40 catalysts, which did cost quite a lot of money, but it did end up giving me a little bit of extra percent attributes, and it's something you really shouldn't consider until it's one of the final things you can min-max in your build. The other thing you could do, which I'd really recommend to do for most people because it's very cheap to do, is if you haven't gotten yourself a corrupted ivory tower, you should look for a corrupted one with something useful on it. Personally, I've been using a 50% reduced extra damage from crits one, as this along with Defiance Banner is giving me a 100% chance to not be crit, which is a really big defensive layer. But you can instead opt to look for any +2 that benefits your Storm Rain setup, or you can instead look for a +1 socketed gems, which would be the best DPS increase. But if you don't want any of that, you could also look for +1 maximum resistances, which would be a really good EHP increase, or either percent life or percent ES. And that is all there really is to mention for this. The swap over to Righteous Providence is fairly simple to do, and there really isn't much you really need to change about your tree and your build, just because I either attempted to do my best to get you set up with all the gear that you need to be able to swap to Righteous Providence as soon as possible, or we just need to craft 1 or 2 items to get the swap going. I will be releasing one final video on this build, and that is going to be the absolute super high-end, super min-max setup that's going to push over 1 billion DPS. It's going to have basically double the EHP of this, but I do want to warn you that it's going to be very expensive. But realistically, at this point, with just how much Righteous Providence is, I don't think worrying about a few extra 100 div is really going to be a problem when you have to pay a mirror just to be able to swap over Righteous Providence. I'm really sorry for the price increase on Righteous Providence, and I wish there was something I could do to make it better, but unfortunately, that is the way the market goes, and I've never once seen a Forbidden Flesh and Flame combo hit a mirror in value, but here we are. Affliction is a little bit of a crazy league, and I still hope you're having fun with the build, even if you aren't swapping over to Righteous Providence. No matter what, this build is just really OP as it is, so as I mentioned, you do not need to play Righteous Providence to do all content, but if you do swap over to Righteous Providence, you will be able to make this build just the silliest build I've ever actually played in Path of Exile. I love this build. I'm having so much fun with it. I'm so happy with it that I've crafted 2, and we're going to be crafting the 3rd mirror item for the build here in a few days. And I wouldn't have gone this far, I wouldn't have been maxed this much if this build wasn't worth playing, and if this build wasn't just so fun to play. If you have any questions, cuties, please feel free to let me know in the comments below. I'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions as soon as I can. Or if you want to come by my Twitch and ask me a question there personally, I'll be more than happy to help you on stream. Or if you just simply want to come hang out with all the cuties, I'll be more than happy to see you with everyone else there. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you cuties in the next video.